So in this video, we're going to talk about evidence, how we know anything about the past, and why we have to be very careful about what we think we do know. So this is a question that you might want to be asking yourself. How do past events get to us? The past is dead. Everybody in it is dead. All of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in this course is dust and long gone. So what are the different ways in which information gets to us from the past? Some of the answers that you might be coming up with as you think about this. The most obvious way to historians, and one that in some ways has been overemphasized, is written documents. Written documents are a deliberate way of communicating across space and time. And we'll talk more about the development of writing, what that means, what kind of a revolution that is for humanity later on. What we're looking at here, by the way, is Sumerian cuneiform, quite possibly the oldest form of writing developed certainly in this part of the world, the product of the civilization of ancient Sumer from 5,000 years ago. So written documents are deliberately designed to convey information across space and across time. Before there's writing, or when in supplement to writing, or when writing goes away and comes back, as is sometimes the case when civilizations crash and rise again. There is also oral history, a means of transmitting information across time without the use of writing. And this is a very complex thing, because it has to be done in a systematic way. You might have had personal experience of how oral transmission of information can rapidly become corrupted. The classic example is the children's game of telephone. But some societies have a deliberate process in place to perform the function of writing, to communicate stories to future generations. One of the most interesting examples of this is when the Bronze Age Greek civilization collapsed after the fall of Troy. The people of the Aegean did not have writing for 300 or 400 years. And during that time, they told stories to future generations, including the story of the Battle of Troy and the things that happened afterwards, using oral history, using epic poetry, using the song of the rhapsode, the bard, an image of which we're looking at here. So the thing about oral history that's quite fascinating is that in order for it to work, you still have to relate to your audience. Your audience is going to be different from one generation to the next as values and customs and technology changes. And so when the story is retold each time, it has to be told using the understanding of the audience. It has to be changed. It has to reshape itself in order for the audience to relate to it. And so even when there's a system of master storytellers and apprentices, as there was in Dark Age Greece after the fall of the Bronze Age, there's still a necessity to retell the story in a way that makes sense to each new audience. And so the result of this is that oral history tends to preserve the plot elements of stories, but to reframe them in the social milieu of the time in which it's being told. And so as a result, The most famous examples of this, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the epic poetry of Homer that transmits the events of the stories of the Battle of Troy and the fall of Troy, across the collapse of the Bronze Age, across the 4 centuries of the Dark Age, to the revived and new Greek civilization that rises afterwards. Across those 4 centuries, what happens is we end up with a story that tells us tale of events from the Battle of Troy around 1200 BCE, but in the social context, in the culture of the people that were around when the story was finally written down, around 750, 800 BCE. And that means that the Iliad and the Odyssey preserve information for us both about Bronze Age Greece and the time of Homer, which it was written down 400 years later. The next category of things that of ways that information is communicated across time is actual physical objects that survive from the past, and so archaeology, the actual physical remnants of ancient cities and peoples, is one example of this. Another example of this is the things that people use every day that are durable. Most of the things that people use every day, even clothing and wood and these kinds of things, tend to deteriorate and rot, and so most of that is lost to us after as long a time as it has taken. But certain kinds of things, obviously, stone and metal and these kinds of things, and pottery, ceramics, tend to be able to survive, and for this reason, we end up having to rely upon those particular kinds of material culture, which gives us a incomplete picture, as you can well imagine. And then other kinds of examples, including all different kinds of arts. Archaeology can also qualify as art, painting, sculptures, murals, frescoes, mosaics, and so forth and so on. What we're looking at here is a fresco of a young woman from the destroyed Roman city of Pompeii. And so forth and so on. And there can be overlap with documents too, so that, for example, what we're looking at here is a tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The writing of this, the content of it, is telling a story, is conveying written literature. But the tablet itself is a relic of this time and place. This tablet itself is 4,000 and more years old, and the physical object tells us about how the society worked and how they preserved the information and how they used the writing system, and so forth and so on. The other thing you can tell just looking at this is that this tablet is broken and damaged, and this is actually one of the better preserved of the original 11 tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this means this reflects a fundamental problem, which is that what survives to us from the past is not going to be in pristine condition. What survives to us from the past is going to be broken and damaged and incomplete, and some, in many cases, destroyed and not come down to us at all. And so, this is true both for this physical object of the tablet and for the story that it tells, the content. Both of them are damaged and incomplete, and that is profoundly typical of what happens when we study history in all periods, but particularly and especially ancient history. So, what are we left with? When we are trying to understand the past, we have multiple levels of evidence, multiple different kinds of evidence. Broadly speaking, most of what we've just been talking about is primary sources, written documents that tell a story that is from that time and place, straight from the horse's mouth. And material culture and archaeology also fall into this category, that are direct from a time and place. Um, Secondary sources are when a scholar collects all of that primary information and provides an interpretation, provides an understanding of what he or she thinks all of this means, why a particular event took place, what we can understand from a particular moment, a particular kind of story, and so forth and so on. It is always interpretation. It is always an opinion about what that primary evidence tells us. And then a level even further from the source, from the original, is tertiary sources, which boil down all of the different things that scholars have said on the subject, and present, a pat and summarized, version of what historians generally think. This is the least useful to any of us. It is because it is distortion upon distortion upon distortion. The way in which history gets made is that scholars present opinions about the past and say and present those opinions to the scholarly community, and the scholarly community responds by counter arguments, by agreement, by disagreement, and through the course of this, and this tends to go on. This tends to be living and organic. Our understanding of the past is never settled. It continues to evolve. It continues to be refined, and in some cases, new evidence or new interpretations emerge that are so compelling that we have to rethink what we know. This happens in other disciplines too. This happens even in science, where new theories can overturn what people think they've known for hundreds of years. But in history, this is the process. The process is to take the evidence that we have at hand, and our job is to interpret it before the historical community. So here's the thing: is that we have an essential problem. Our most useful piece of information is the primary source, is eyewitness testimony. But primary sources are fundamentally flawed. And the essential reason for this has to do with the fact that every single primary source, every single written document is incomplete. It is flawed because it was written for a reason. Every single thing that was ever written was written for a reason. That reason was to convince somebody of an idea, to convince somebody of an opinion. And so that means that every single written document that you will ever read was written with the intent of convincing you of an opinion. And so that means that whatever was written is going to the writer is going to select what is included, what is not included, is going to select for emphasis, is going to use rhetoric to intensify whatever supports that idea. And as a result, you have to start with every document you ever read by saying, what is the author trying to convince me of? Alongside this, there's also unintentional bias, which is that you have no control over the furniture of your mind, over how your thinking was shaped by who you are, by how you were raised, by the culture that helped to infuse values and expectations in you. And so as a result, if somebody who was raised as an American in Indiana is going to view the Battle of Marathon in ancient Greece, he's going to stand there and describe it in a different way, based on his own ideas and values, compared to a Spartan warrior who is standing next to him. And that Spartan warrior is going to describe it in a different way compared to an Athenian standing next to him and the Persian standing next to him. They're all going to see the same thing and look at the same event and give fundamentally different stories about it. Not only that, but in the scenario I just described, this also underlines the fact that these people are standing in a particular place, which conditions what it is that they see. And so even if you're an eyewitness, even if you're describing a particular event, it's still going to only be a partial view. And then your reason for communicating that and who you are adds distortion upon distortion. And then on top of that, you have the problem of survival. I've mentioned that some of the documents that we have are physically damaged, coming to us from the past. And it's even more than that, because most of the documents in the past were written on materials that have since been rotted, have since been lost to us through the natural process of entropy and deterioration. And so the things that are carved in stone, things that are engraved in bronze or something like this, extremely rare. These are things that are only done for the most important, most formal of things, and things like the Epic of Gilgamesh that were inscribed into clay tablets, even these things break and fall apart or are lost. But all the things that were rotted, that were written on parchment or papyrus or linen or other ancient materials, if we have them now, that's because they survived, which is a hit or miss chance, up to a point where somebody copied it down perhaps in the Middle Ages in order to be transmitted further. And if you think about it, the Middle Ages, who is in control of writing and information in the Middle Ages in Europe? It's going to be, by and large, the church. It's going to be, by and large, the clergy. And as a result, the things that are survive are not only things that survive as a part of random chance, but things that are selected to be written down or not written down. And so there are many things that survived from the ancient world into the Middle Ages that were deliberately not passed down to us because the monks and abbots and so forth of the Middle Ages considered them to be blasphemous or inappropriate. But even just the vagaries of nature, you may know of the Anglo-Saxon poem of Beowulf from the early Middle Ages, and we only have this today because there's a single copy that survived, and that copy only just barely survived because the home of the person who owned it burned down at some point, and he deliberately went back into the burning building in order to salvage this last remaining copy of Beowulf. And if you go and see it in the museum today, you can still see the singed edges. And on top of that, you have to consider that certainly in terms of ancient history, every single thing that you're looking at, every single primary source, every single written document was written in some other language, and so has been translated into English for us. And that introduces two problems. One is, you can imagine, the translator has his own set of mental furniture, and so the translator introduces his own layer of shape onto the document. And beyond that, English is a remarkable and in some ways unique language. And the languages of the ancient world are very different from it. The languages of Greek and Latin and Aramaic and Egyptian and so forth and so on are profoundly different from the English language, and are based in worlds that are profoundly different from ours. And so we can't actually hear what the people in these written documents are actually saying. And so as a result, every single primary source that we have, every single written document that tells us anything about history is fundamentally flawed. And this leads us to a remarkable conclusion that there are no facts in history. There are no solid pieces of information that are incontrovertible, because all of our evidence is damaged, incomplete, and biased. And so as a result, history consists entirely of interpretation. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that it's all futile, that we can't really know what happened? The process is to take the information that we have and use logic and reason to formulate an understanding of what would have produced the evidence that we have. And so for me, the quote that we have in front of us is probably the most important quote in all of human literature. So this is books are not made to be believed, but to be subjected to inquiry. When we consider a book, we mustn't ask ourselves what it says, but what it means. You cannot take the written word at face value. You cannot passively accept the written word. You must challenge it every time. And the cap on this, of course, is that this comes from the excellent novel The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Umberto Eco wrote this maxim in Italian. So this is not even what Umberto Eco said. So what does this mean? How does this work? How do we take all of this and make history work? Well, all right. So here's an example. We have a document that describes the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE in quite useful detail. This document was written by Pliny the Younger. And he is physically there. He was present at the eruption. He was there in a ship in the bay, and so he's able to give us a great deal of firsthand testimony about what it is like to be there, and so forth and so on. But nothing is ever written for no reason. This document was written for a purpose. All documents are written for a purpose. This document was written in order to lionize, to praise his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who had gone into the settlements around the feet of Vesuvius in order to rescue as many people as possible before he himself succumbed to the poisonous fumes and died amidst all this calamity. And so Pliny the Younger is writing this in order to frame, this man as a hero. So does this is obviously fundamentally biased. Does this mean we have to throw it away? Of course not. What it means is that we have to unpack it. We have to look at it and say, why was this document written? And so this allows us to categorize and unpack the information that comes in it. So the basic information, what it's like to be there, the rolling of the bay, the smell of the sulfur in the air, all of these things, and the incidental facts of what towns and villas and so forth are like in the period of Roman history that we're talking about. All of that we can take a fairly straightforward way. The closer we get to the purpose of the document, the character of Pliny the Elder, that is when we have to use this information more carefully. That's where we have to compare it to other information that we might have about Pliny the Elder, compare it to other sources that we have, and when we talk about it, use it with discretion and with and communicate that this is a more problematic element of the source. And so this is what the process of looking at evidence involves. It involves looking at at understanding what the problems are with the evidence that we're looking at, and using that to build our own interpretation, our own subjective understanding of this moment, this time, and these people. And that's that.